Karan, bulldozers have always been about showing who is in power, and they are a tactic of brute force. They have very little to do with law, and they have everything to do with brute power. And it's clear from all the instances that I've studied, and as you rightly pointed out, the affidavit that was presented in the Punjab and Haryana High Court by the Haryana administration said that there were 354 people who were affected by the demolitions, 281 of whom were Muslim. So, as you can see, a large proportion, though not all, but a very large proportion of people who are affected are Muslim.
Is the Supreme Court being naive in believing guidelines will make a difference?
But as I've said, guidelines on its own will not make a difference. It will, and on its own is a critical phrase, because if the Supreme Court wants to lay down guidelines, sure, they can go ahead and lay down guidelines and it will provide greater clarity. But on its own, in my view, and it may be pessimistic, it will not make a whiff of difference on the ground because governments are violating the law at this point of time. The law does not allow them to carry out bulldozer demolitions in the way in which they are doing.
Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. The Supreme Court's decision to lay down guidelines for the forced bulldozer demolition of houses has been welcomed, but is it an effective and meaningful response, or could it be naive and even inadequate? My guest today has written revealingly and powerfully about this issue. Joining me today to share his views is the Research Director of the Vidhi Centre for Legal Policy, Arghya Sengupta. Arghya Sengupta, in a powerful piece that you wrote for the Times of India last week on bulldozer demolitions, you began by pointing out that whether they happen in Mandsaur and Khargon in Madhya Pradesh, Sabarkant and Khambat in Gujarat, Jahangirpuri in Delhi, or Prayagraj, Kanpur and Saharanpur in UP, in each case, the preponderant majority of houses that are demolished are Muslim houses. In fact, the Haryana administration has actually admitted to the Punjab and Haryana High Court that in the case of Nuh, nearly 80% of the houses that were demolished were Muslim. So am I right in saying this is clearly directed at the Muslim community? Only a small minority of Hindus or people of other faiths are affected?
Karan, bulldozers have always been about showing who is in power, and they are a tactic of brute force. They have very little to do with law, and they have everything to do with brute power. And it's clear from all the instances that I've studied, and as you rightly pointed out, the affidavit that was presented in the Punjab and Haryana High Court by the Haryana administration said that there were 354 people who were affected by the demolitions, 281 of whom were Muslim. So as you can see, a large proportion, though not all, but a very large proportion of people who are affected are Muslim. And I think the second point, which is equally critical, is that the ostensible justification that is provided for bulldozer action is that the encroachments are illegal. That is the ostensible justification. But as I'd written in an earlier piece, as the fact that the bulldozers are about building regulations is really like saying that the Mahabharata and the war in the Mahabharata was about a piece of land, right? It may be true, but it's really beside the point. The question is that every time bulldozer action has followed an incident of communal violence. And so illegal encroachment may or may not have been there. That is beside the point. But it has always followed, troublingly, an incident of communal violence.
So what you're saying is, regardless of the excuse or explanation provided by the authorities, bulldozer justice, as it's called, is in fact retribution for communal violence or alleged communal violence.
First up, I have grave issues with this term bulldozer justice, because I don't think the terms bulldozer and justice go well with each other. And I think that we should all consciously steer clear of avoiding this terminology, though that is what it is commonly called. I think it's bulldozer injustice if there were ever, if these two terms had to come together. But the semantics of this point aside, I think that each time there is a fig leaf of legality that is sought by saying, and lawyers do say this in court, that this was illegal for ABC reasons. So let me take a concrete example. The example that I had quoted in my article on Udaipur, where there were two boys, young boys, one Hindu and Muslim, who were in some scuffle, and the Hindu boy was injured, and then there was a demolition. The very next day, the house of the Muslim boy was demolished by a joint operation, according to news reports, of the Forest Department of Rajasthan and the Udaipur Municipal Corporation. Now, it is beside the point as to whether this land was actually illegal or not. It well may have been, but the timing of it, if it was illegal, it was not as if the illegality was discovered that day. The illegality would have perhaps been discovered a long time ago. But the demolition being done the day after this incident has happened is always meant to send out a clear message that illegality or otherwise, this is a message that who is in power now and that everyone in society should know their place. So
You
I
make
think, yeah.
Sorry, you make another very important point about bulldozer demolitions. I will deliberately use the term bulldozer demolitions.
Thank you.
Point, I will eschew bulldozer justice, although, as you pointed out, that is the common phrase used these days. The second point you make is that most municipal statutes allow for emergency demolitions only when the structure is unsafe and could collapse. Otherwise, there's a procedure for 15 days notice and hearing together with another procedure for appeal. Bulldozer demolitions not only ignore that, they deliberately, consciously violate it.
Yeah, so there are kind of two views on facts here, because in some cases the lawyers say that the notice was indeed served. So I'm not aware of the facts of in particular cases as to whether this was followed or not. But in most instances where bulldozer demolitions do take place, they have the whiff of instant justice. The bulldozers just pull in, if at all the notice is given the day before, and they pull in and they demolish your property before you have an opportunity to react. In fact, going back a couple of years, I had seen the case of this small time politician in Allahabad, Prayagraj, as it is now called, Javed Mohammed, whose house was demolished. He was leading a protest against Nupur Sharma, who had allegedly made those comments against the Prophet. And in that case, I had looked at some papers, and it was clear that the notice had been served the day before. Whereas the Prayagraj Municipal Corporation rules had clearly said that you have to give 15 days notice, number one. Number two, then there has to be a hearing that has to happen before the municipal authority. Then there is a mandatory waiting period with a provision for appeal. After which and you can go to court at any point of time, mind you, in this process, and only after this process, fairly lengthy, as you can understand, is over, can you demolish a property. And the logic is clear, because this action is irreversible. So you need to have safeguards and checks and balances before you demolish somebody's property. But it was clear to me in that case that this procedure was not followed. There is an exception. But the exception is if a house is unsafe, and is going to topple over, then you can quickly go and demolish it. But even there, first the opportunity has to be given to the homeowner to demolish that house themselves. And if they fail to do it, only in that case can the municipal authorities come in. I would be very surprised if these notice requirements are being followed in all these cases. But if I am wrong, I would be very happy.
As you point out, citing that example of Javed, bulldozer demolition in the way it was done in that case is a flagrant violation of the law as it stands. It is not justice. As you said, it's injustice, which is why you say in your Times of India article, short-circuiting the procedure laid down in municipal statutes is not expediting justice. It's showing people who holds the reins of power. And then you add very tellingly, demolitions are often uncivilized demonstrations of brute power. Indeed, you compare them in your article with the Taliban destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas. That was horrific when it happened. What you're suggesting is bulldozer demolition, when it happens in this way, is no less horrific and no less acceptable.
Yes, it's no less horrific for families, because it's their entire life that has completely gone in a moment and reduced to rubble. It's also no less for a society. Because once you start this, go down this slippery slope, there is no end. Because the bulldozer itself knows no religion, it only knows power. And once we sanction this kind of action, I fear for the worst. Because the simple point here is that as far as this activity of bulldozers being used by politicians to show their strength, I think the deeper question that arises is, what does it say of us as a society? That we, as a society somewhere, and I don't think we can only blame politicians, because politicians are doing this because they think that it caters to their constituents. And as constituents, maybe as a society, we feel that instant justice is preferable to a long and arduous process of law. So I think this is a moment of deep introspection, particularly for folks in the legal fraternity, that the law is failing, the legal system is failing, people are losing faith, which is why politicians are catering to these forms of instant justice that have no place in civilized society.
Now, in response, the Supreme Court has said it will lay down guidelines to be followed while demolishing houses. You say, and I'm quoting you from your article, this is unlikely on its own to yield the desired results. And the reason is simple and straightforward. When governments don't follow the law that they themselves have enacted, when directive after directive of courts to desist from the use of bulldozers to avenge crimes is ignored, is it likely that a fresh set of guidelines will be respected? Clearly, the answer is no. So let me ask you, is the Supreme Court being naive in believing guidelines will make a difference?
But as I've said, guidelines on its own will not make a difference. It will, and on its own is a critical phrase, because if the Supreme Court wants to lay down guidelines, sure, they can go ahead and lay down guidelines and it will provide greater clarity. But on its own, in my view, and it may be pessimistic, it will not make a whiff of difference on the ground, because governments are violating the law at this point of time. The law does not allow them to carry out bulldozer demolitions in the way in which they are doing. And
in which case, can I interrupt and ask, if it won't make, and I'm quoting you, a whiff of difference on the ground, then is this decision to lay down guidelines naivete on the part of the Supreme Court?
I hope this is a first step. If the matter ended here with the guidelines, I would say that this is a very myopic step. I wouldn't call it naive, I would call it myopic. If the guidelines was where this matter ended and the court thinks that now they have solved this problem. As you can see, and I think we are having this discussion in the aftermath of the Supreme Court directive to junior doctors in Calcutta to stop protesting by 5 p.m. yesterday, that has fallen on deaf ears.
Day
So
before
in a
yesterday.
matter,
Not yesterday, day before yesterday, Tuesday.
day before yesterday, I'm sorry, but as you can that's right, day before yesterday. And as you can see that in a matter as important as that, when the directive is very clear, it's not being followed. So
absolutely. And can I interrupt and say that even in this case of guidelines being laid down, which have yet to be laid down, but that's what the Supreme Court has committed itself to do, A.K. Sharma, a minister of the youth Uttar Pradesh government, has publicly said bulldozers will continue to be used. He's defying the court. He's deliberately in breach of what the court would want. And therefore, I come back. Not only are guidelines ineffective for the reasons you say, but if the Supreme Court believes they'll make a difference, this is naivete.
yeah, so Karan, as in with my legal training, I never want to ever call the court naive. I think it's disrespectful to do that. But as I've said again, that if the Supreme Court is serious, because it is clearly well intentioned in its effort to try and stop this rampant use of bulldozers, and I think we must salute that spirit. That in this day and age where everyone seems to be celebrating instant justice, somebody in a position of power is standing up against it. And I think
not standing up, simply laying down guidelines. Let's not overinterpret what the Supreme Court is doing, because you make a second point about guidelines, and I'd like to put that to you so the audience can hear that second point. You say guidelines work when government needs guidance on how to go about doing something that is vague. Demolition without due notice is an action that is so wrong that governments do not need guidelines to tell them that it is so. They know it, but they still do it. So, here once again, if the Supreme Court believes laying down guidelines will make a difference, I come back to the point I'm making. It's once again naivete.
No, so again, I'm coming back again to, sorry to sound like a broken record, but to make the point that I was making, which is the fact that the Supreme Court cannot stop at making guidelines. And if it stops at making guidelines, it is short-sighted. It needs to go ahead, and as I've said earlier, the Patna High Court has done it. It needs to go ahead and haul up officers for contempt. It needs to compensate persons who have lost their houses, and that compensation should come from the salary of the errant officers. It's actual punitive measures of that kind that I think will bring a stop, or at least have a better chance of stopping something of this.
This Arghya Sengupta is the key and heart of the article you wrote for the Times of India. But I'll point out for the audience all the things that you suggest, and which I will now pick up and discuss in some detail, were not, repeat, not part of anything that the Supreme Court itself has proposed. It talked about laying down guidelines. They still haven't been laid down. Hopefully, they will be laid down soon. But after that, it didn't say a word about what would follow and what would happen in addition. And you say, if the Supreme Court is really serious about stopping such demolitions, it must haul up officers responsible for them. And that's because these demolitions are not just a violation of the law, they are also contempt of the orders of the Supreme Court. For them to continue and to continue to happen unchecked would be a repeated slap in the face of the Supreme Court. So, to simply preserve its own dignity, leave aside, stop this terrible injustice happening, it has to take the step you're saying, which is haul up the officers concerned.
Absolutely. And I think that the Supreme Court needs to do it to protect its own institutional legitimacy. I have said on many occasions that the Supreme Court needs to very carefully weigh which matters it needs to come into. The RG Kaur matter is one that I have gone on record saying it should not have gotten into because it damages its institutional reputation. But bulldozers is one that it has to get into. It is a question of law every time, and it is an abuse of law. So when its orders are defied, then this is a fit case for the use of the contempt power of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court doesn't use that power wantonly, and rightly so. But this, if ever there is a fit case for use of the contempt power, then those officers who are demolishing without notice or without adequate notice need to be hauled up for contempt of court, so that the next time a political boss orders a demolition, that officer at least thinks twice.
Let me point out that in that article you wrote for the Times of India, you specified 3 steps that must be taken, and I presume by the Supreme Court. First, you said, imprison the officer or officers responsible for illegal demolitions. Second, compensate the person whose house has been demolished from the salary of the errant officer. Third, initiate dismissal proceedings. You say it's only when all 3 steps are taken that the docile officer who acts in this way, or the brazen political boss who orders him to do so, will start to think twice about running a bulldozer through people's houses. In other words, those guidelines on their own, I keep using that word, are naive and meaningless. But you do agree with the meaningless part. They won't achieve anything. But if these 3 steps follow, then effective action will be taken, punishment to errant officers will be given, and hopefully demolitions will cease. Illegal demolitions will cease.
I agree that, and I think we can agree on this, that guidelines on their own are meaningless and insufficient, because it's not as if the officers don't know that what they're doing is wrong. So it's not as if the guidelines are needed to tell them that it is wrong. What is needed is strict punitive action in these cases, because that is the only way that we can hope that somebody who has a conscience and is tasked with this job of demolition thinks before taking that particular action.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.
Let me ask you this, Arghya Sengupta. What are the chances that the Supreme Court is prepared to take the steps you so clearly and cogently spelled out? I note, and you mentioned this briefly yourself a moment ago, that the Patna High Court has begun to move in this direction. What are the chances the Supreme Court will follow suit?
I don't know. I'm not a soothsayer. Very hard to say what the Supreme Court will or won't do. But the matter is on. The hearing is I think they're scheduled for later this month. So I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that the Supreme Court will see that simply laying down guidelines will not be enough, and will walk its talk and will take the necessary next.
The corollary to your argument is that unless the court steps in and implements the 3 steps that you've identified, governments will continue to illegally demolish houses. And that means Muslims will continue to be at the receiving end of this illegal behavior, which is not just a deliberate violation of the law, it's also deliberate contempt of court. That's the corollary, isn't it? Oh dear, the screen seems to have frozen at that point. I think we've lost Arghya Sengupta, but that was literally the last question I intended to ask, so I'll leave the interview there. I'll simply repeat that thought for the audience. The corollary to Arghya Sengupta's argument is that if the court does not take the steps that he spelled out, governments will continue to illegally demolish houses, and Muslims will continue to be at the receiving end of this illegal behavior, which is not just a deliberate violation of the law, but also deliberate contempt of court. So to ensure that the dignity of the court is upheld, i.e. in its own interest and not just in the interest of justice, the Supreme Court must take tougher, further action. We'll end there. My thanks to Arghya Sengupta, even though we've lost him. Thank you very much, Arghya Sengupta.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.